Part 1, The Hook and Thesis. The consensus question. The End of Evangelion is widely regarded as a visceral, catastrophic conclusion to a deconstructive mecha series, a spectacle of apocalyptic body horror that serves as a final, nihilistic judgment upon its characters and audience. This consensus frames the film as a punitive response to the fans of the original television run, asserting that the transition into Third Impact is a deliberate act of destruction meant to punish the viewer for their escapism. However, this reading obscures the film's fundamental operation. It is not a meta-commentary on the medium of anime, but a profound and empathetic exercise in existential reclamation. The film utilizes the total dissolution of individual ego to force a confrontation with the terrifying necessity of the other. The psychological, structural, and visual collapse of the narrative is the mechanism by which the film argues that existence is only made meaningful through the acceptance of pain and the risk of interpersonal vulnerability. The world of the End of Evangelion is defined by a desperate scarcity of intimacy. In the lead-up to the cataclysm, the characters inhabit spaces of profound architectural and emotional alienation. NERV headquarters functions as an echo chamber of industrial coldness, where the human element is treated as mere biological hardware to be plugged into the EVA units. The film presents this environment as a system that relies on the repression of the individual to sustain a false, fragile order. As the narrative progresses toward the Instrumentality Project, the visual landscape shifts from the clinical rigidity of the command center to the fluid, boundaryless chaos of the collective subconscious. The film uses this transition to dismantle the idea that human identity is an immutable fact, illustrating that without the structural barriers of the ego, the individual is both infinite and utterly erased. The protagonist, Shinji Ikari, acts as the crucible for this philosophical inquiry. His trauma is not merely a backstory element but the somatic reality around which the entire plot rotates. The film stores his struggle in the physical sensations of his pilot suit, the claustrophobia of the entry plug, and the repetitive, agonizing patterns of his combat cycles. Shinji's eventual choice to reject the singular, perfect piece of instrumentality, a state where all pain is dissolved through the loss of the self, is the film's central moral pivot. By choosing to return to a world defined by the hedgehog's dilemma, where he is capable of hurting others and being hurt in return, Shinji affirms the necessity of the individual. This is not a surrender to a cruel status quo but an active, courageous construction of meaning in a universe that offers no inherent protection from suffering. The film's visual language is essential to this argument. The use of mixed media, live-action footage, and experimental animation techniques creates a jarring, recursive effect that pushes the viewer out of a passive, observational role. When the film cuts to blurred photographs of the real world or captures the actor's own lived spaces, it forces a direct collision between the audience's reality and the fabricated struggle on screen. These technical disruptions demonstrate that the suffering depicted is not confined to the screen but is an inevitable component of the human experience. The cinematography emphasizes this through extreme isolation. Even during the grand, global scale of the apocalypse, the camera consistently returns to the minute, trembling details of Shinji's internal state. The VFX, ranging from the grotesque, tactile transformation of the EVA 01 to the stark, blank white of the collective consciousness, serve to render the intangible concepts of the ego and the soul into visible, physical crises. The final frame of the film, showing the desolate, red-hued aftermath of Third Impact, is often misread as a bleak ending. In truth, it is the ultimate affirmation of the film's thesis. By forcing Shinji to navigate a world that is essentially empty and fundamentally broken, the film strips away every layer of artifice, expectation, and external validation. When Shinji attempts to strangle Asuka, he is reacting to the terrifying vulnerability of her presence, only to be stopped by the warmth of her hand against his cheek. This singular, tactile interaction acts as the final evidence for the film's morality. It asserts that the chaos of reality is preferable to the stillness of a singular, artificial heaven. The film concludes by insisting that the struggle to define oneself in the presence of another is the only, and therefore the most significant, human endeavor. The End of Evangelion does not punish its audience with its ending. It offers a radical, uncompromising invitation to persist in the reality of human connection. The subversion question. The End of Evangelion is frequently categorized as a punishing, nihilistic deconstruction of the giant robot genre, a reactionary screed against the escapism of its own fan base. This interpretation, however, is a fundamental misreading that frames the film as a moralistic critique rather than a radical exercise in radical intimacy. The film is not a rejection of fantasy, it is an uncompromising, visceral argument for the necessity of individual pain as the only authentic gateway to human connection. By stripping away the bureaucratic artifice of NERV and the mythic distance of the Evangelions, the film shifts from a spectacle of global catastrophe to a claustrophobic examination of the hedgehog's dilemma. The thesis of the film is that the dissolution of the ego into a singular, undifferentiated consciousness, instrumentality, is the ultimate surrender to cowardice, and that the retention of the boundaries between self and other, while causing immense suffering, remains the only act of true love. The world of the End of Evangelion is defined by an encroaching, white void sterility that threatens to dissolve the messy, tactile reality of human existence. The production design emphasizes this decay. Tokyo 3 is no longer a strategic bastion but a graveyard of concrete and rusted rebar, a hollow shell where the high-tech machinery of the past has been rendered obsolete by the metaphysical ambition of the present. The bureaucracy that once governed the characters, the hushed corridors of NERV, the boardrooms of SEAL, collapses in the face of the third impact. As the barriers of the AT field dissolve, the film visually manifests this transition through the shift from jagged, kinetic combat to the fluid, oceanic abstraction of collective consciousness. The film treats human individuality as a fragile, physical construct, and the collapse of this structure is represented as a literal return to a primordial soup where names, memories, and traumas are bleached of their distinctiveness. At the center of this transformation is Shinji Ikari, whose psychological disintegration acts as the engine for the film's metaphysical stakes. Shinji's trauma is not merely an internal hurdle, it is the physical catalyst for the end of the world. The film refuses to treat Shinji's depression as a narrative device to be overcome through heroic action. Instead, it positions his inability to reconcile his need for external validation with his fear of intimacy as the defining struggle of human existence. The somatic memory of the Evangelion pilots, where the trauma of the machine is inextricably linked to the trauma of the mother, illustrates the film's commitment to the idea that our identities are forged through the physical weight of our pasts. The sequences occurring within the white, infinite void of instrumentality function as a brutal deconstruction of the self, where the protagonist is forced to confront the faces of those he hates and loves, not as external beings, but as fragments of his own fractured psyche. Technically, the film employs an erratic, experimental aesthetic to collapse the distance between the viewer and the subject. The integration of live-action footage, charcoal sketches, and traditional animation serves to break the illusion of the film as a self-contained story. By inserting images of real-world cinema audiences and derelict urban environments, the film forces the viewer to acknowledge their own role as a voyeur in Shinji's suffering. The audio mix, punctuated by the silence of the void and the wet, visceral sounds of organic transformation, emphasizes the grotesque reality of existing as an individual. This is not a film that seeks to comfort, it is a film that uses the medium to demand that the viewer acknowledge the terrifying, lonely responsibility of being a distinct I. The climax on the beach, the iconic final encounter between Shinji and Asuka, serves as the definitive rebuttal to the desire for a cohesive, pain-free existence. In a world where all borders have been erased, Shinji chooses to rebuild his physical self, to suffer the return of the ego, and to risk the hatred of the other. The film posits that the agony of rejection is superior to the stagnation of collective oneness. This is not a nihilistic ending, it is a profound affirmation of the human condition. The final exchange of violence, and the subsequent moment of tactile, pained mercy, represents the only way to inhabit a world where love is possible. The film concludes that existence is a cycle of collision, but within those collisions, we find the proof of our own reality. The End of Evangelion does not merely depict the end of a world, it documents the terrifying, essential labor of choosing to exist within it. The anomaly question. The End of Evangelion functions as a brutal, necessary exorcism of the viewer's desire for narrative comfort, positioning the act of observation itself as a catalyst for trauma. While often characterized as a mere conclusion to a televised series, the film is a deliberate structural rupture that forces the audience to confront the parasitic nature of the fan-creator relationship. The central anomaly, the jarring, live-action montage of real-world cinema audiences interspersed with the animated destruction of Tokyo 3, serves as the film's thesis. It is the moment the narrative barrier collapses, declaring that the character's suffering is not a spectacle to be consumed, but a mirror reflecting the stagnation of a culture obsessed with fictional escape. The film operates within a reality defined by the absolute erosion of the individual. In the world of NERV, human bodies are not biological entities but precarious vessels for the soul, constantly threatened by the prospect of instrumentality, a forced synthesis of consciousness that promises the end of loneliness at the cost of the self. This economic reality treats human ego as the final, untradeable currency. The architectural hierarchy of the Geo-front, a sprawling, industrial abyss located beneath the surface of a fractured Earth, visually enforces the insignificance of the individual. Characters like Shinji Ikari are not protagonists in a heroic mold, but raw materials processed by a machine designed to extract emotional labor for the sake of global survival. The film treats this labor with visceral, unflinching detail, rendering the physical toll on the EVA pilots as a form of systemic exploitation. Shinji's internal trajectory is one of catastrophic disillusionment. His trauma is not merely a backstory but a somatic reality, stored in the phantom pains of his cinched connection to the Evangelion units. As the barrier between reality and the subconscious disintegrates, Shinji experiences an epistemic fracture where the binary of self and other becomes impossible to maintain. He does not undergo a traditional arc of growth, rather, he experiences the collapse of his fabricated ego, the belief that his worth is tied to his utility as a pilot. The film refuses to offer the standard catharsis of redemption. Instead, it offers the terror of radical autonomy. When given the choice to return to a world of pain and separation or to remain in a singular, painless collective consciousness, Shinji's ultimate rejection of instrumentality is a desperate, violent embrace of his own boundaries. The technical execution of the film serves this philosophical aim with cold precision. The shift from the hyper-stylized, vibrant animation of the series to the grainy, desaturated, and often grotesque imagery of the third act highlights the exhaustion of the medium. The use of experimental editing, abrupt shifts into static photography, and the auditory intrusion of diegetic screams creates a sensory environment that demands an active, uncomfortable engagement from the viewer. The film utilizes the uncanny valley not as a failure of craft, but as a deliberate tool, by making the characters appear at times disjointed, distorted, or strangely vacant. It emphasizes the hollow nature of their roles within the NERV machine. The final sequence on the beach, where Shinji attempts to strangle Asuka, is the ultimate rejection of the audience's expectations. This act, coming after the existential weight of the preceding hours, functions as a brutal affirmation of the self. Even after the world has ended and been reformed, the struggle to acknowledge the other remains a source of agony. The film concludes not with the harmony of a resolved narrative, but with the cold, isolated reality of continued existence. It argues that the pain of being a distinct, bounded individual is the only authentic state of human life, and that the desire to lose oneself in the comfort of a unified narrative is a death drive. The End of Evangelion stands as a definitive rejection of the screen as a sanctuary, forcing the viewer to realize that they, too, are bound to the same cycle of longing, alienation, and the heavy, necessary burden of selfhood. The synthesis question. The End of Evangelion functions as a radical rejection of the comfort inherent in narrative closure, asserting that the individual's agonizing, ego-bound struggle with the reality of the other is the only authentic state of human existence. While the film is frequently discussed as a nihilistic deconstruction of the mecha genre, it is, in truth, an unflinching theological argument for the necessity of suffering as the precursor to individuation. The film posits that the dissolution of the ego into a singular, undifferentiated consciousness, the Instrumentality Project, is a death of the soul, and that true existence requires the vulnerability of potential injury that only comes with physical boundaries. The core conflict of the film is not the external battle against the invading angels or the bureaucracy of Seal, but the internal collapse of Shinji Ikari, whose refusal to merge with the collective consciousness affirms that the pain of rejection is an essential component of the human experience. This psychological rupture is mirrored by the film's sociological framework, which strips away the veneer of institutional order to reveal a world sustained by transactional relationships. NERV's hierarchical structure, once a bastion of defensive security, is revealed to be a fragile apparatus of control that collapses the moment its utility is exhausted. The characters exist in a state of terminal scarcity, not merely of resources, but of genuine empathy, leading them to consume one another's identities as a defense mechanism against their own loneliness. By placing the final decision of humanity's future in the hands of a traumatized, isolated boy, the film forces the viewer to confront the limitations of the moral calculus. Shinji's choice to reject instrumentality is not a heroic triumph of good over evil, but a deeply selfish, terrifyingly human act of assertion. He chooses the possibility of hurt over the safety of oblivion, grounding the film's high-concept philosophy in the visceral reality of a child's need to be seen as an individual. The technical execution of the film reinforces this thesis through a deliberate disruption of the viewer's immersion. The integration of live-action footage, abstract avant-garde sequences, and jarring shifts in medium acts as a direct assault on the audience's desire for a coherent, escapist fantasy. The most potent visual proof of this argument occurs in the final sequence on the shore of a shattered Earth, where the animation oscillates between the hyper-rendered detail of the film's climax and the raw, static imagery of the real world. This transition strips the characters of their archetypal, heroic status, forcing them into the stark, unforgiving light of their own isolation. The camera's refusal to provide a wide, clarifying shot of the new world emphasizes that there is no grand resolution or return to order, only the persistent, heavy breath of two survivors left in the silence. Philosophically, the film operates on the premise that the boundaries between bodies are the only barrier against the absolute horror of the void. By framing the merging of all human minds as a terrifying, viscous sea of LCL, the End of Evangelion subverts the utopian desire for universal unity, rendering it as a totalizing, claustrophobic erasure of the self. The film suggests that the hedgehog's dilemma, the idea that proximity inevitably leads to pain, is not a problem to be solved, but a fundamental law of nature that defines human agency. This existential stance renders the struggle of the characters meaningful precisely because it is doomed to be difficult. The film concludes not with the promise of peace, but with the assertion that the capacity for pain is a privilege of the living. By forcing the protagonist to choose his own broken reality over a manufactured, painless perfection, the film serves as a final, defiant vindication of the individual, proving that the most authentic expression of selfhood is the willingness to be hurt by the world. Part 2. Context and world building. Systems, scarcity, and capital. The End of Evangelion functions as a violent rejection of collective salvation, positing that human identity is a fragile architecture built upon the necessity of suffering. The film argues that the pain of individuation is the essential price of existence, and any system, whether bureaucratic, religious, or technological, that seeks to dissolve this friction into a state of total unity is an instrument of existential erasure. By dismantling the barriers between self and other, the film demonstrates that the loss of the ego results in the loss of meaning itself. In the world of Tokyo 3, reality is governed by an economy of metaphysical scarcity. The fundamental currency is the soul, and the monopoly on this resource is held by NERV and the SEAL Committee, whose control is visualized through the crushing scale of Geofront and the sterile, interface-heavy monitors of the Magi. While the civilian population operates within a baseline of mundane, post-catastrophic survival, evidenced by the routine evacuation of schools and the normalization of bunkers, the true labor of the world is the commodification of biological and spiritual essence. EVA units are not mere machines but synthetic, captured consciousnesses, turning human trauma into the only viable defensive asset against an encroaching void. This technological gatekeeping forces the pilots into a state of involuntary labor, where their own somatic wounds serve as the fuel for the global survival apparatus. Shinji Ikari's internal collapse acts as the focal point for this systemic failure. His trauma is a physical, pulsing reality, stored in the phantom pains of his body and the repetitive, self-destructive impulses he manifests when forced to pilot the EVA. The film treats the body as a precarious vessel, constantly threatened by absorption into the collective. Shinji's eventual encounter with Rei Ayanami and the Lilith entity serves as the ultimate epistemic fracture, the moment he realizes that his reality was a construct defined by the needs of an indifferent organization, his ego disintegrates. This is not a liberation but a terrifying exposure to the truth that his identity was always a derivative of the system's requirements. His struggle to return to the physical world, marred by conflict and profound isolation, serves as the final testament to his rejection of the oceanic bliss of instrumentality. The film utilizes a brutal, disjointed visual language to mirror this internal fragmentation. Cinematographically, the use of extreme close-ups, alternating with wide, desolate shots of the shattered cityscape, creates a geography of isolation where individual agency is dwarfed by the massive, shifting tectonic plates of the Instrumentality Project. The sound design, alternating between the screeching, mechanical screams of the EVA units and the absolute, oppressive silence of the void, reinforces the protagonist's psychic erosion. When the film transitions into live-action photography or jarring, avant-garde animation sequences, it breaks the immersion of the narrative, forcing the viewer to confront the medium itself. This technique reveals the artificiality of the comfort offered by the instrumentality. Ultimately, the film stands as a defense of the hedgehog's dilemma. By choosing a reality that contains both the potential for agony and the possibility of genuine connection, the protagonist rejects the seamless, painless conformity of the collective. The final frame, depicting the decimated landscape and the fractured, visceral remains of the human experience, is a declaration of presence. The struggle to exist as an individual, with all the accompanying errors and pain, is rendered as the only authentic choice. The End of Evangelion concludes that the fragmentation of humanity is not a failure of design but the very mechanism that makes human life recognizable and worthy of preservation. The catharsis is found not in resolution, but in the stubborn insistence on remaining a separate, defined entity in a universe that constantly demands total, indifferent unity. Architecture and the visual geography. The narrative trajectory of the End of Evangelion functions as a visceral collapse of the barrier between the internal human psyche and the external, built environment. Tokyo E3 serves as the primary artifact of a world in terminal decay, where the architectural hierarchy is not merely a statement of socio-economic status, but a testament to the aggressive failure of human survivalism. The city is defined by its radical verticality. The upper-tier facilities of NERV headquarters represent a sterile, subterranean monument to technical hubris, buried deep beneath the earth to shield a hollow bureaucracy from the very monsters it birthed. Conversely, the surface level exists as a shifting, mechanical graveyard, a landscape of retractable skyscrapers and heavy plating that prioritizes rapid tactical reconfiguration over the needs of human habitation. The geography is fundamentally non-human, designed solely to facilitate the deployment of Evangelion units, relegating the civilian population to the status of inconsequential variables in a grander, cold-blooded geometry. The visual language of the film emphasizes this decay through the pervasive presence of rusted-out infrastructure and obsolete hardware. Even in the film's most technologically advanced moments, the world carries the weight of a golden age long since collapsed. The contrast between the synthetic and the organic is absolute. The natural world has been purged, replaced by the persistent, suffocating red hue of the post-second impact atmosphere. Nature is effectively a memory, represented only through the harsh, monochromatic starkness of the environment or the grotesque, fluid-filled biological chambers where the EVA units, the ultimate synthesis of human flesh and machine, are housed. The production design ensures that there is no softness to be found. Every corner is jagged, every bulkhead is pressurized, and every corridor leads back to a central, crushing system of command. Navigation through this space mirrors the character's own claustrophobia. The camera does not linger on vistas of open ground but instead tracks protagonists through cramped, labyrinthine service tunnels and exposed elevator shafts that emphasize the vertical instability of their existence. When the narrative moves to a broader scale, the film utilizes expansive, wide-angle compositions to reinforce the absolute insignificance of the individual against the system. The sheer scale of the mass-production EVAs or the colossal, decaying form of Lilith serves to dwarf the human cast, turning the battlefield into a site of existential erasure. These wide shots act as a visual manifestation of the system's indifference. The architecture does not exist to serve humanity, but to house the instruments of its potential extinction. The film's reliance on deep compositing and layered, dense imagery transforms Tokyo 3 into a prison of its own making. The infrastructure is in a constant state of disrepair, with debris and exposed wiring serving as a permanent backdrop to the human drama. This environmental collapse forces the viewer to acknowledge that the characters are living in a temporary, crumbling construct built upon the ruins of a global catastrophe. The hierarchy is clear: the higher the tier, the more detached and destructive the actor. The bureaucrats residing in the deepest levels of NERV hold absolute power, yet they reside within the most suffocating, synthetic environments, effectively trapping themselves in the very engine of their impending destruction. As the film progresses toward the third impact, the architecture itself dissolves, reflecting the final, total surrender of the material world to the overwhelming surge of collective human consciousness. The spatial reality of the film is a feedback loop of mechanical necessity, proving that when society builds only to survive, it eventually constructs the very walls that seal its fate. Epistemology, information, and society. The End of Evangelion functions as a radical interrogation of reality, positioning the collapse of the individual ego not as a mystical event, but as the inevitable consequence of a society that has offloaded its epistemological foundation onto a singular, mediated truth. The film posits that human connection is fundamentally impossible in a world where reality is defined solely by institutional consensus and rigid, prepackaged historical narratives. By dismantling the visual and structural hierarchies of NERV, the film reveals that the world of the EVA pilots is a closed loop of information, where the citizens are starved of context, fed only by the propaganda engines of SEAL and the shadowy architects of the Human Instrumentality Project. In this universe, truth is not an objective constant but a commodity managed by an elite vanguard who possess the exclusive technological gatekeeping necessary to define existence. The official history of the Second Impact, a fabricated narrative of celestial disaster, serves as the baseline myth that keeps the populace compliant and ignorant of the biological, synthetic reality of the Evangelions. Information here is processed through layers of bureaucracy and cold, clinical surveillance, turning the sprawling architecture of NERV into a panopticon where data is used to extract performance from the pilots rather than to foster understanding. The characters, trapped in this environment, suffer from an epistemic fracture because they are forced to synthesize their personal traumas through a vocabulary provided by their captors. Shinji Ikari's struggle is a desperate attempt to locate his own subjectivity within a system designed to treat his consciousness as a mere component, a neural interface to be harvested for the sake of a collective, soulless evolution. The film visually communicates this systemic repression through its architectural geography, which prioritizes the sterile, subterranean, and functional over the organic. As the narrative descends into the cataclysm of Third Impact, the shift from high-tech, geometric confinement to the amorphous, fleshy, and grotesque landscape of Raylilith represents the ultimate breaking point of the synthetic world. The transition highlights the poverty of a society that sought to standardize humanity. Because the characters exist in a state of permanent exile, socially isolated by their specific, trauma-laden roles as pilots and physically confined to the rigid, steel-wall geography of Tokyo, 3, they possess no foundation for authentic identity. Their actions are driven by a desperate desire to reconcile the self with a reality that actively denies the validity of individual suffering. The propaganda engine driving this world reaches its zenith in the instrumentality sequence, where the distinction between objective reality and internal projection dissolves entirely. Here, the film proves that the ultimate lie told by the ruling class is that human pain can be solved by the elimination of the boundaries of the self. By presenting the collapse of individual ego as a liberation from the burden of communication, the film exposes the manipulative logic of a system that views human distinctiveness as a failure to be corrected. The characters find themselves confronting the void not because they lack connection, but because they have been deprived of the language necessary to establish it outside of the dictates of the system. Ultimately, the film serves as an indictment of any structure that views the individual as a resource to be managed. The chaos of the final act is the result of the system collapsing under its own weight, as the simulated reality it maintained is incinerated by the raw, chaotic manifestation of human desire. When the walls of NERV shatter, the visual language moves from the calculated, sharp-edged aesthetic of military technology to a surrealist, unmediated nightmare. This shift confirms that the order maintained throughout the film was never a representation of the natural world, but a thin, technological mask covering a fundamental, terrifying ambiguity. By the conclusion, the film rejects the promise of a peaceful, singular consensus, instead forcing the viewer to confront the necessity of the individual, flawed, and isolated other. The legacy of the film lies in its refusal to offer a clean synthesis. Instead, it demands that the viewer recognize the act of existing, of maintaining one's own, separate reality, as the only truly revolutionary response to a world that demands we surrender to the collective. Friction, law, and the catalyst. The End of Evangelion functions as a brutal examination of the individual's desire for connection within a world where boundaries between consciousness and reality have effectively eroded. The film posits that the primary obstacle to human existence is not external catastrophe, but the inherent agony of the hedgehog's dilemma, the inescapable pain of being an individual who requires, yet simultaneously fears, the proximity of others. This existential impasse forces a total collapse of the collective human ego, manifesting as the Instrumentality Project, a process that dismantles the discrete self to achieve a static, frictionless state of unity. The film demonstrates that human identity, constructed as it is upon the fragile recognition of the other, is fundamentally incompatible with a desire for total security, framing the struggle to maintain one's individual boundaries as the most heroic, albeit terrifying, act a human can undertake. The world of the End of Evangelion is defined by a complete surrender of public authority to the clandestine, near-omnipotent organization NERV. The state has long since been eclipsed by a technocratic elite that manipulates geopolitical and existential infrastructure to achieve a singular theological goal. In this reality, human labor and the biological form are commodified as literal fuel for an artificial deity. The pilots of the Evangelion units are not soldiers in a traditional sense, but psychological conduits for a synthetic biological machine. This structure creates an environment where technology acts as an extension of repressed human psyche, forcing characters to navigate a geography where the physical ruins of a post-apocalyptic Tokyo mirror the internal wreckage of their own fractured senses of self. Information is entirely weaponized, with the public and the personnel alike denied access to the true nature of their existence, leaving them trapped in a cycle of combat against manifestations of their own collective trauma. Central to this collapse is the dissolution of the boundary between the internal and the external. Shinji Ikari exists in a state of terminal self-negation, his identity entirely defined by the performative expectations of the paternal authority figures who demand his compliance as a prerequisite for validation. As the narrative progresses, the film strips away the protective layers of his ego, forcing him to witness the total failure of the systems he once relied upon for guidance. His trajectory is a movement toward the absolute realization that his perception of reality, and his place within it, has been a fabrication designed to maintain his utility. When this reality fractures, he is confronted with the raw, terrifying responsibility of choice. The film argues that this moment of crisis, where the protagonist is stripped of all social roles and ideological crutches, is the only point at which true agency becomes possible. Philosophically, the film rejects the comfort of collective salvation. By presenting human instrumentality as a state of forced, painless unity, the narrative forces a confrontation with the necessity of pain as an essential component of the human experience. To exist as an individual is to suffer the risk of rejection, yet this specific, localized suffering is precisely what defines personhood. The film's moral framework hinges on the rejection of a singular, harmonious truth, instead celebrating the chaotic, painful, and often ugly reality of autonomous existence. Through the imagery of the giant, cosmic form of reimagines and the visceral, decaying anatomy of the Evangelion units, the film visualizes the horrific toll of erasing these boundaries. The synthesis of this craft, the melding of high-concept animation, jarring live-action intrusion, and an aggressive, dissonant soundscape, serves to disorient the viewer, forcing them to experience the same existential displacement as the protagonist. The final moments of the film serve as a definitive act of rebellion against the temptation of erasure. By choosing a world where individual boundaries are restored, complete with the potential for rejection and suffering, the protagonist affirms that the struggle for identity is the ultimate value. The film does not offer a promise of healing or a resolution to the central trauma, rather, it provides the cold, hard baseline of reality as the only place where human meaning can be forged. It stands as an assertion that to be a discrete individual, isolated and prone to pain, is ultimately preferable to the sterile peace of the collective void. The legacy of this film lies in its unflinching demand that the viewer accept their own boundaries, recognizing that while the search for connection is the source of all human agony, it remains the singular requirement for the existence of the self. Part 3. The Human Element. Epistemology and the Metanarrative of the Self. The End of Evangelion functions as a brutal deconstruction of the defensive narratives humans construct to survive the terror of existence. The protagonist, Shinji Ikari, enters the film anchored by a fabricated ego, the martyr pilot who performs the necessary, agonizing labor of piloting the EVA because he is fundamentally worthless otherwise. This narrative is his primary psychic armor, shielding him from the reality that his identity is a projection defined entirely by the expectations of NERV and his estranged father. His epistemic fracture begins the moment he realizes his internal worth is not contingent upon this role, but is instead an independent, albeit terrifying, burden. As the walls of his reality dissolve into the third impact, he confronts the realization that his suffering has been a self-imposed prison, a cycle of repetition compulsion where he invites pain to avoid the greater risk of genuine human connection. Shinji's internal monologue functions as a graveyard for the words he cannot speak, creating a profound chasm between his silence and his reality. He is trapped by the limits of a language defined by trauma and technical jargon. He possesses the vocabulary to describe the mechanical status of his Eva, yet he lacks the foundational syntax to articulate his own desire for intimacy. This linguistic confinement forces him into a state of perpetual cognitive dissonance. When he ultimately reaches the climax of the film, his actions, alternating between violent, destructive outbursts and frozen, paralytic surrender, violently contradict his stated moral desire to be a good person. He justifies these atrocities as the only logical conclusion to a world that refuses to love him, effectively using his pain as a shield to justify the annihilation of the collective ego. The trauma in the film is not merely a memory, it is a somatic force residing within the pilots' bodies, manifesting as the synchronization with the Eva units. By treating their bodies as extendable, pluggable hardware, the characters suffer a profound dissociation that mirrors their psychological alienation. Their physical bodies are constantly assaulted, reconstructed, and merged, serving as literal metaphors for the loss of self. This repetition compulsion is the engine of the film. They return to the pilot's seat not because of duty, but because they are terrified of the silence of their own minds without the external structure of combat. They inhabit the cockpit to escape the mirror, believing that if they can save the world, they might eventually possess a self worth saving. The film pushes characters toward the absolute boundaries of the ego, forcing them to confront the shadow represented by the Instrumentality Project. Instrumentality is the ultimate, terrifying resolution to the problem of human isolation, proposing a world where the boundaries of the self are removed to eliminate misunderstanding. From the perspective of the architects of this process, the erasure of individual consciousness is a logical, pragmatic solution to the chaos of interpersonal friction. Yet, the film argues that the pain of maintaining a separate, flawed ego is the essential precondition for existence. By the final frame, the narrative moves away from the systematic, technological desire for union and settles on the agonizing, individual choice to remain apart. The struggle to exist as a distinct, vulnerable entity, capable of being hurt by others, is the film's final testament to the value of the individual. Shinji's eventual rejection of the singular, perfect reality of the hive mind confirms that the messiness of the human experience is not a failure of design, but the primary purpose of being. The ending provides no grand catharsis, only the daunting, quiet permission to continue the cycle of living, forever imperfect and forever exposed. Trauma and somatic experiencing. The End of Evangelion functions as a visceral inquiry into the architecture of the human psyche, positing that trauma is not merely an abstract memory but a physiological weight etched into the very fabric of existence. At the center of this exploration is Shinji Ikari, whose foundational wound, the abandonment by his father and the unresolved grief of his mother's death, manifests as a pervasive, somatic imprisonment. The film treats the Evangelion units not as tools of war, but as externalized, metal-fleshed extensions of the characters' repressed histories. By tethering the pilot's neural interface to the Eva synthetic nervous system, the narrative collapses the distance between the internal ego and the externalized trauma. The pain of the machine is the pain of the child, the blood splattered against the cockpit walls is the physical leakage of an interiority that can no longer contain its own history. This somatic memory dictates the film's erratic, breathless rhythm. The characters suffer from a haunting repetition compulsion, constantly drifting back into the precise environments and relational deadlocks that catalyzed their initial breakdown. Shinji's inability to reconcile his desire for intimacy with his fear of the pain that accompanies it forces him to continuously reenact his own isolation. He treats his physical body as a cage, viewing the tactile reality of other people, the hedgehog's dilemma, as a direct threat to his integrity. When he eventually chooses to initiate the Instrumentality Project, he is seeking an anesthetic for the somatic ache of existing as a distinct, vulnerable entity. The film characterizes this choice as an attempt to dissolve the friction between self and other, transforming the act of existence from a painful, individual experience into a frictionless, collective non-existence. The film reveals its depth by grounding these psychological shifts in harsh, material imagery. The third act, in particular, strips away the technological artifice to expose the raw, organic machinery of the soul. As the boundaries of the self dissolve into the LCL of the Human Instrumentality Project, the camera lingers on images of biological flux, wombs, cellular structures, and the encroaching ocean of consciousness. This is the ultimate somatic experience, the total annihilation of physical borders. The trauma stored in Shinji's body, his heavy limbs, his trembling hands, his suffocating awareness of his own heart, finds its resolution or destruction only when the body itself is discarded. The film's brilliance lies in its refusal to offer a clean detachment from this suffering. It insists that the character's defense mechanisms, the avoidant retreats and the dissociative episodes, are necessary, albeit destructive, survival strategies. Even as the world unravels in a display of cosmic scale and nightmarish CGI, the focus remains stubbornly fixed on the specific, intimate movements of the human form. Whether it is the frantic grasping of fingers or the sound of ragged breathing, the narrative asserts that trauma leaves a permanent imprint upon the physical reality of the survivor. The conclusion, featuring the two survivors alone on a ruined shore, re-established the necessity of the body. By returning to the site of physical sensation, the pain of choking, the grit of the sand, the warmth of another human presence, the film argues that the reclamation of the self requires a direct, unmediated confrontation with the reality of the flesh. The trauma remains, but by inhabiting the body once more, the protagonist acknowledges that the capacity for pain is the essential requirement for the possibility of connection. The end of the film is not a transcendence into a higher, pain-free state, but a return to the heavy, broken, and beautiful work of existing as an individual within a physical world. The shadow and the antagonist. The End of Evangelion functions as a brutal dissection of the ego, utilizing the Jungian shadow to externalize the internal fracturing of its protagonist, Shinji Ikari. The film's antagonistic forces, personified by the cold pragmatism of Gendo Ikari and the calculating detachment of Seal, are not mere external threats but are the manifestations of the very traits Shinji fears in himself. Gendo, in his clinical pursuit of instrumentality, represents the extreme logical end of Shinji's own withdrawal from the world. Where Shinji retreats into a shell of self-loathing to avoid hurt, Gendo weaponizes that same isolation to reshape reality, demonstrating the destructive potential of an ego that refuses to acknowledge its own need for connection. Their conflict is a confrontation between the son's passive rejection of humanity and the father's active, systematic dismantling of it. The psychological mirroring extends to the film's broader cast, most notably through the character of Asuka Langley Sarayu. Asuka occupies the same traumatic topography as Shinji, yet she serves as a counter-trajectory in the face of identical circumstances. While both are bound by the necessity of piloting the EVA units, a labor that commodifies their very biology, Asuka attempts to synthesize her trauma through a performative, aggressive autonomy. She demands recognition from a world she refuses to trust, positioning herself as the inverse of Shinji's inertia. Her desperate climb toward competence acts as a foil to Shinji's collapse, highlighting the fragility of their respective defense mechanisms. When the system demands their emotional capital, Asuka's struggle is to consume the world to validate her existence, while Shinji's is to vanish from the world to preserve his perceived integrity. These dynamics are inherently parasitic. The Evangelion units and the organization of NERV feed upon the emotional and somatic vulnerability of the children, turning the physical embodiment of their trauma into a battlefield asset. This exploitation relies on the characters projecting their flaws onto one another to maintain a fragile, artificial sense of self. Shinji's inability to reconcile his identity leads him to project his own self-hatred onto the people he desperately craves, viewing their attempts at closeness as invasions or betrayals. By doing so, he prevents the formation of any true symbiosis, ensuring that he remains trapped in a feedback loop of suspicion and isolation. The antagonist's logic, particularly that of the Human Instrumentality Project, proposes the total eradication of these boundaries as the only solution to the pain caused by such projection. From the perspective of the architects of instrumentality, the elimination of the individual ego is the ultimate rational act. they view human suffering as a byproduct of the AT field, the psychological barrier that separates the self from the other. To them, removing this barrier is a mercy, a pragmatic rectification of the evolutionary error that allows for loneliness. This worldview is terrifying precisely because it is internally consistent. It treats the complexities of the human spirit as errors in a system that can be debugged through collective dissolution. The film forces the audience to confront the fact that, within the cold framework of the antagonists, the destruction of the individual is a logical necessity for peace. Ultimately, the film posits that the struggle to define oneself against a crushing, indifferent system is the defining characteristic of the human experience. The shadow in the End of Evangelion is not an external villain to be defeated, but the latent potential for self-destruction that exists within every character. Shinji's final confrontation is not with Gendo or the monolithic entities of Seal, but with his own capacity to surrender his agency for the promise of a painless, egoless existence. By choosing the messy, painful reality of the individual over the absolute perfection of the collective, Shinji rejects the logic of his antagonists. The film asserts that the human element is defined not by the successful navigation of trauma, but by the persistent, irrational choice to exist as a separate, flawed entity, even when the entire system of the world demands otherwise. The visual proof of the psyche. The End of Evangelion functions as a visceral inquiry into the formation of the individual ego, arguing that the psyche is not a sovereign fortress but a fragile construct held together by the perception of others. The film posits that human identity is inextricably bound to the presence of external observers, and when the barrier between self and other dissolves, the individual is forced to confront the terrifying reality of their own internal emptiness. This psychological disintegration serves as the foundational narrative arc, transforming the mechanical spectacle of the Evangelion units into a profound metaphor for the vulnerability of the human soul. The film meticulously dismantles the characters' defenses by stripping away the performative environments that maintain their social identities. Within the sterile, industrial command centers of NERV, characters like Shinji Ikari and Asuka Langley Sarayu project a facade of duty and competence. However, the visual language of the film, characterized by claustrophobic interior framing and harsh, synthetic lighting, consistently renders these spaces as cages rather than sanctuaries. As the narrative progresses, the production design shifts from the rigid geometry of military corridors to the fluid, unstable imagery of instrumentality, where the physical boundaries of the characters literally liquefy. This transition mirrors the erosion of the ego, illustrating that the characters' identities are contingent upon the physical limits of their own bodies. Shinji's psychological collapse is documented through an intense synthesis of subjective imagery and somatic experience. His trauma is stored as a series of repeating, intrusive visual motifs, the sight of blood, the rhythmic thrumming of the entry plug, and the phantom sensation of being held or rejected. The film uses these diegetic triggers to force the viewer into the same fractured headspace as the protagonist, creating a state of cognitive overload that mirrors Shinji's inability to reconcile his self-image with the reality of his actions. When he confronts the truth of his own cowardice and desire for validation, his behavior ceases to be humanly consistent. He retreats into a catatonic, almost robotic state, reflecting the failure of his previous coping mechanisms. The film suggests that the ego is merely a narrative device that fails the moment it is confronted with the absolute, unmediated truth of one's own insignificance. The visual representation of this psychological state relies heavily on the juxtaposition of the organic and the synthetic. The Evangelion units themselves serve as the ultimate physical manifestation of the characters' repressed psyches, acting as literal shells that house the traumatized cores of the pilots. The grotesque, fleshy interiors of the mechs contrast sharply with the cold, technological exteriors, visually reinforcing the idea that the soul is trapped within a system designed for warfare. As these boundaries dissolve during the third impact, the resulting imagery, a surreal, dreamlike landscape of giant, overlapping consciousnesses, serves as the final breaking point. The facade of the autonomous individual disappears entirely, leaving behind a raw, undifferentiated mass of human suffering and longing. The film ultimately lands on a profound existential paradox. The pain of existence is caused by the boundaries that keep us apart, yet those very boundaries are what allow us to possess a self. By stripping away the ego and forcing the characters to merge into a singular, undifferentiated consciousness, the End of Evangelion demonstrates that true, unobstructed connection is indistinguishable from total annihilation. The final moments of the film do not offer a neat resolution to the characters' traumas, but rather a return to the messy, painful reality of physical separation. The return of individual form on the red, desolate beach signifies an acceptance of the self as a finite, isolated entity. By choosing to exist as an individual, with all the accompanying risks of pain and rejection, Shinji reaffirms the necessity of the ego. The struggle to maintain one's boundaries against the crushing weight of the collective is the essential act of being human, and the film concludes that this struggle is, in itself, the only meaningful validation of existence. Part 4. Philosophical Underpinnings. Epistemology and Discourse. The End of Evangelion functions as a radical interrogation of the boundaries between internal experience and external reality, positing that human existence is defined entirely by the epistemic limits of the individual ego. The film rejects the possibility of an objective, shared truth, suggesting instead that reality is a construct formed by the collision of disparate subjective perspectives. By visualizing the process of third impact as the dissolution of physical boundaries, the film exposes the inherent violence of empathy. To truly know another is to cease to be oneself. The narrative architecture is built upon the premise that communication is fundamentally flawed. Characters exist within impenetrable psychological silos, unable to transmit the totality of their inner lives. Language serves as a fragile, insufficient tool, failing to bridge the chasm between the self and the other. The film's discourse is defined by this persistent communicative failure. When Shinji Ikari or Asuka Langley Sarayo attempt to articulate their suffering, they find their vocabulary colonized by the trauma of their pasts and the rigid roles demanded by NERV. Truth in this world is not a collective agreement but an epistemic fortress, guarded by the ego to prevent the annihilation of the distinct personality. The film serves as a brutal critique of the desire for a unified, transcendent truth. Through the Instrumentality Project, the antagonist Gendo Ikari seeks to collapse the space between individuals, creating a world where every consciousness is merged into a single, cohesive entity. From his perspective, this is an act of liberation from the pain of individual existence. However, the film frames this resolution as the ultimate epistemic catastrophe. The destruction of the individual ego eliminates the other, and without the presence of a distinct exteriority, the concept of truth itself vanishes. In a state of total, singular consciousness, the very possibility of discourse is extinguished, leaving only the stagnant, undifferentiated void of the primordial sea. The visual language of the film reinforces this epistemological instability. The transition from high-fidelity animation to live-action footage, abstract sketches, and documentarist-style photography forces the viewer to confront the medium itself as a deceptive construct. These shifts disrupt the audience's suspension of disbelief, mirroring the characters' realization that their perceived reality is merely one layer of a shifting, volatile consciousness. By juxtaposing the photorealistic images of a modern, indifferent Tokyo with the surreal, cosmic horror of the EVA units, the film demonstrates that truth is entirely dependent upon the observer's location within the hierarchy of systems. At the center of this philosophical inquiry is the problem of the body as a sensory filter. The characters act as prisoners of their own neurological inputs, unable to verify the existence of anything outside their personal perception. The film relies on a profound sense of Cartesian doubt. The characters cannot distinguish between physical external events and the hallucinatory projections of their own subconscious. The recurring motif of the Red Sea, a transformation of the material world into a homogeneous, unrecognizable substance, illustrates the erasure of objective reality. Once the world is stripped of its recognizable textures and hierarchies, the individual is forced to confront the absolute void of a universe without a shared, meaningful language. Ultimately, the film posits that the struggle to maintain one's individuality is an ethical necessity. The rejection of instrumentality is a rejection of a forced, totalizing truth in favor of the painful, isolating, but authentic reality of the individual. By choosing to exist as a separate, flawed entity, the protagonist asserts that the meaning of human life is found not in the acquisition of absolute knowledge, but in the vulnerable, incomplete act of reaching out to another person across the divide. The final sequence does not offer the comfort of a resolved, unified narrative. It offers the terrifying, necessary freedom of a world where the self is once again the only authority over its own truth. The film concludes with the assertion that the pain of isolation is the foundational condition of personhood, and that to possess a name, a body, and a distinct perspective is the only reality that matters in a universe otherwise devoid of inherent meaning. Metanarratives and social theory. The End of Evangelion functions as a radical dismantling of the grand narratives that once provided humanity with a coherent sense of teleological purpose. The film operates within a reality where the traditional structures of religious transcendence, state-sanctioned heroism, and humanist progress have collectively collapsed, leaving the individual stranded in a landscape of hyperreality. Within this framework, the Instrumentality Project serves as the ultimate culmination of an ideological state apparatus, an attempt by the ruling elite at NERV and SEAL to force a synthesis of consciousness that replaces the messy, distinct borders of human identity with a singular, perfected simulation of oneness. The film argues that this drive toward unity is a desperate reaction to the failures of the physical world, wherein the commodification of individual experience, manifested in the mass production of Evangelion units and the weaponization of the soul, has rendered the status quo unsustainable. The film meticulously illustrates how the symbols and screens of technology have entirely supplanted objective physical reality. Characters like Shinji Ikari and Rei Ayanami exist within a Baudrillardian simulation, where their identities are mediated through interfaces, control panels, and the recurring imagery of the EVA units themselves. The state apparatuses within the film utilize this digital mediation to ensure compliance, transforming the trauma of combat into a spectator event or an abstract data point. By the time the third impact begins, the boundary between the internal psyche and the external world dissolves. The physical world is literally overwritten by the projection of human fear and desire. This process confirms that the characters are trapped in a self-correcting feedback loop. Every attempt to achieve self-actualization through the established institutional channels, be it through the military discipline of NERV or the philosophical dictates of the Human Instrumentality Committee, only accelerates the dissolution of the ego, reinforcing the very entrapment the characters seek to escape. In this environment, rebellion is not merely suppressed, it is absorbed and repurposed by the system to justify its own final objectives. When characters act against the grain, their angst and suffering are treated as essential components for the success of the Human Instrumentality Project. The film highlights the irony that the system requires the individual's profound dissatisfaction to catalyze its totalizing solution. By placing the power of the end of the world in the hands of a traumatized, isolated youth, the film forces a confrontation between the individual's desire for self-annihilation and the system's requirement for total order. The resulting chaos is not a failure of the mechanism, but the unavoidable byproduct of imposing a singular, artificial narrative onto the chaotic, fragmented reality of human existence. The moral calculus of the film posits that the attempt to solve human suffering through total structural integration is a rejection of the fundamental absurdity of life. The characters confront a void where the old maps of religion and ideology no longer function, yet they remain tethered to the physical pain of their own existence. The film identifies this connection to the physical, the tactile, aching, and finite nature of the human body as the final redoubt against totalizing control. Through the lens of existential revolt, the film asserts that meaning cannot be inherited from a grand narrative or a collective consciousness. Instead, it must be carved out of the persistent, often painful recognition of the other. In the final, haunting frames, the film discards the promise of a harmonious simulation in favor of a reality defined by the messy, unoptimized, and singular presence of the individual. It posits that the true act of defiance against the system is the choice to exist as a separate, bounded entity, even when that existence guarantees further suffering. The film concludes that the struggle to define oneself, independent of the ideological apparatus, remains the only valid project in a world stripped of its inherited illusions. Ethics and the moral calculus. The End of Evangelion functions as an uncompromising interrogation of the moral cost of existence, stripping away the traditional heroism of its genre to reveal a profound conflict between the comfort of collective non-being and the painful necessity of the individual self. At its core, the film presents an ethical calculus that transcends the standard trolley problem, elevating it to an existential scale where the survival of the species is pitted against the sanctity of the lonely, suffering ego. The Instrumentality Project, championed by Shinji Ikari and later seized by Rei Ayanami, offers a utilitarian resolution to human suffering, the dissolution of all barriers, the AT fields, that define the boundaries between individuals. By merging all consciousness into a singular, undifferentiated superprimordial existence, the project promises an end to the misunderstandings, rejection, and emotional friction that plague human interaction. It is a logic of absolute peace achieved through the annihilation of the distinct subject. Shinji Ikari's eventual rejection of this synthesis serves as the film's central moral pivot. He recognizes that a state of collective harmony is fundamentally a form of death, as it removes the possibility of the other, and by extension, the possibility of genuine connection. The film argues that morality cannot exist in a vacuum of total consensus, it requires the presence of an alien, independent will to function. If there is no one else to hurt or be hurt by, the concepts of empathy, sacrifice, and love lose their categorical weight. Shinji's choice to terminate instrumentality and return to a world where individuals are once again isolated, vulnerable, and capable of inflicting pain is an affirmation of the Camusian absurd. He accepts the dreadful freedom of being a separate entity, choosing the chaotic, messy reality of mortal suffering over the sterile, painless certainty of the void. This focus on the individual creates a complex tension regarding the personhood of the non-human. Characters like Rei Ayanami and the EVA units themselves exist in a state of ontological ambiguity, functioning as tools or vessels while simultaneously harboring consciousness or fragments of the soul. The film challenges the audience to find a moral framework for these beings, suggesting that personhood is not inherent but is instead earned through the process of asserting one's existence against a hostile universe. When the EVA units manifest their own agency, most notably in Unit 01's violent, protective autonomy, the film validates the existence of a moral dimension within artificial constructs. They are not merely cold machines, they are repositories of trauma and maternal love, entities that prove that even created things can participate in the project of defining their own meaning. The film further deconstructs the ethics of ignorance versus the burden of truth. Through the harrowing imagery of the third impact, the narrative suggests that the pursuit of a painless life is a delusion that sustains the ruling class and the institutional structures of NERV and SEAL. The truth in this universe is inextricably linked to the acknowledgement of one's own insignificance and the trauma of separation. The film posits that it is morally superior to live within the agony of being known, to be rejected, to suffer, and to fail, than to exist in a state of blissful, unconscious unity. Truth is the catalyst for the individual to act, and action is the only defense against the inevitable entropy of the system. By forcing the characters to confront their deepest shames and failures in the final act, the film insists that moral clarity is found only after the ego has been completely dismantled. Ultimately, the End of Evangelion proposes a fragile, existential ethics. It rejects the allure of the grand narrative, whether it be the promise of technological salvation or religious transcendence, in favor of the mundane, frightening labor of interacting with another human being. The final scene, set on a barren, red-tinged shore, acts as the ultimate test of this framework. Shinji's choice to prioritize the possibility of future human connection over the immediate peace of instrumentality serves as a direct challenge to the viewer. It asserts that the individual, despite being dwarfed by the massive scale of both the cosmic and the bureaucratic machinery of his world, maintains an absolute moral authority over his own life. The struggle to exist as an autonomous subject, regardless of how painful or futile that existence may appear, remains the highest form of ethical commitment the film recognizes. Determinism, agency, and time. The End of Evangelion functions as a brutal investigation into the mechanics of human volition within a universe that treats identity as a malleable, bureaucratic construct. The film systematically deconstructs the illusion of agency, presenting a world where the characters' paths are dictated by predetermined scripts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Human Instrumentality Project, and the repetitive, cyclical nature of their own trauma. Throughout the narrative, the characters are not autonomous actors but manifestations of their environmental conditioning, trapped in a feedback loop where every attempt to exert individual will serves only to fulfill the systemic design of their superiors or the fatalistic inertia of their own unresolved histories. The film poses a radical challenge to the concept of the individual within a grand design. Shinji Ikari's journey, in particular, illustrates the paralysis that accompanies total freedom. When the boundaries of his ego dissolve, he is granted the power to reshape reality, yet this absolute liberty brings no liberation. Instead, it results in an existential collapse. Faced with the void of potentiality, Shinji finds that his choices are inherently informed by his past suffering and the crushing weight of his need for external validation. The film posits that true agency is not a gift bestowed upon the individual by the universe but a terrifying burden that requires the subject to navigate the pain of distinct existence. This tension between the structural and the individual is played out through the visual and narrative hierarchy of NERV. The organization functions as a machine that treats its personnel as interchangeable hardware. Even as the characters fight for their lives, their bodies are literal extensions of the Evangelion units, blurring the line between pilot and tool. The film argues that in a system of totalizing control, the individual is frequently reduced to a conduit for processes they cannot comprehend. The characters struggle against this, but their defiance is often a symptom of their conditioning. By mapping their trauma onto the physical landscape, the shattered buildings of Tokyo 3, the visceral transformation of the Raylilith entity, the film externalizes their internal struggle to carve out a self-contained meaning within a reality that seeks to liquefy all distinctions. The conclusion of the film serves as the final, definitive statement on this philosophical struggle. In the ultimate moment, the decision to reject the oneness of instrumentality and return to the painful, fractured existence of the physical world is an act of defiance against a preordained destiny. This choice marks a transition from a state of deterministic resignation to one of agonizing, subjective existence. By choosing the uncertainty of individuality, with all the associated risks of rejection and suffering, Shinji affirms that the struggle for identity is the only path toward authentic meaning. Part 5: The Craft and Illusion. Cinematography and Spatial Language. The End of Evangelion functions as a masterclass in spatial disorientation, where the cinematography operates as a visceral extension of the protagonist's deteriorating psyche. Throughout the film, the visual hierarchy is meticulously calibrated to reflect the total collapse of the individual within the vast, impersonal machinery of instrumentality. Low-angle shots of the Evangelion units and the monolithic mass production models project an overwhelming sense of dominance, turning these behemoths into architectural landmarks of terror that dwarf the human figures trapped in their shadow. By placing Shinji Ikari consistently within high-angle frames, the camera reinforces his role as a passive victim of forces, both mechanical and metaphysical, that remain far beyond his comprehension. This vertical power structure creates a visual geography of subjugation, where the human element is repeatedly crushed beneath the weight of towering, biomechanical steel. The camera movement functions as an active participant in the film's erratic emotional landscape. During the frenetic, visceral battle sequences, the handheld, shaky camera work transforms the viewer into an overwhelmed witness, gasping for focus amidst the blurred motion of carnage. This instability mirrors the character's internal panic, effectively breaking the illusion of an objective, omniscient narrative. Conversely, the film shifts into an unsettlingly smooth, clinical gaze during the sequences of third impact. When the camera glides with godlike precision over the primordial soup of human consciousness, the movement feels detached and robotic. This transition from the erratic to the frictionless emphasizes the loss of individual agency, suggesting that the camera itself has been subsumed by the cold, unified logic of a collective existence. The color palette architecture of the film serves as a psychological barometer, shifting from the harsh, industrial grays and sterile whites of NERV headquarters to the vivid, hallucinatory reds of the post-human world. As reality begins to bleed into surrealism, the palette undergoes a violent transformation, saturating the frame with deep, oceanic blood reds and piercing, ethereal whites. These colors are not merely atmospheric, they define the boundaries between the private interiority of the characters and the public, shared reality of instrumentality. The accenting of bright, neon-tinged details against oppressive backgrounds highlights the fragility of the human ego, which glows briefly before being extinguished by the encroaching, uniform color of the collective. Depth and negative space are utilized to cultivate a profound sense of existential dread. Shinji is frequently framed against vast, empty horizons or infinite white voids, which strip away the safety of a defined environment. This use of negative space visually articulates the terror of absolute openness, where there is no wall to lean against and no boundary to define the self. When characters are isolated in these frames, the sheer lack of surroundings forces the audience to confront their physical and spiritual insignificance. The film traps its subjects in claustrophobic, synthetic light during the mundane moments of the opening, only to cast them into boundless, empty landscapes during their moments of greatest vulnerability. This spatial manipulation serves to illustrate that whether trapped in a cockpit or adrift in the sea of LCL, the character is fundamentally unable to find a space where they truly belong. Light serves as the final, deceptive architect of the film's reality. Harsh, high-contrast lighting is employed to emphasize the gritty, visceral nature of human violence, highlighting every splinter of bone and splash of blood with unrelenting clarity. However, as the film transitions into the philosophical apex of instrumentality, the lighting softens into a diffused, celestial glow. This shift suggests an artificial dreamscape, a comforting, luminous lie designed to mask the erasure of individual identity. By alternating between the searing, painful clarity of physical reality and the soft, obscured luminescence of the void, the cinematography highlights the central tension of the film, the choice between the painful, brightly lit struggle of existing as a distinct self and the painless, softly lit oblivion of being everything at once. Each frame is a calculated deception, using light to pull the viewer closer to the truth while simultaneously veiling the horror of total unity. VFX, CGI, and the technical uncanny. The End of Evangelion represents a singular achievement in animation, where the technical execution functions as an extension of the protagonist's deteriorating psyche. The film utilizes a deliberate, aggressive hybridization of mediums, cell animation, live-action footage, and experimental compositing, to dismantle the wall between the viewer's reality and the internal nightmare of the characters. By rejecting a uniform visual language, the production creates a tactile sense of instability that mirrors Shinji Ikari's inability to reconcile his external environment with his subjective experience. The integration of these diverse elements is purposefully jarring, particularly during the onset of the third impact. When the film transitions from high-fidelity, hand-drawn character work to live-action segments, such as the shots of theater audiences or the grainy, documentary-style footage of Tokyo streets, it achieves a metatextual rupture. This is not a failure of polish but a strategic use of the technical uncanny. The live-action footage, characterized by its distinct lighting temperature and film grain, clashes with the hypersaturated, color-coded world of the EVAs. This creates a sensory dissonance that forces the audience to confront the physical reality of the medium, stripping away the comfort of the animated distance. When the film cuts to real-world spaces, it breaks the diegetic spell, forcing an identification between the viewer sitting in a theater and the characters struggling with their existence. The CGI elements within the film are employed with a raw, almost violent precision that favors weight and impact over seamless integration. The EVA units, when rendered or composite, possess a distinct, unnatural heft. During the battle at the Geo front, the mechanical movements of the machines are calculated to feel rigid and unforgiving, emphasizing the industrial nature of the conflict. The integration of these digital components relies on high-contrast lighting and stark outlines, ensuring they occupy space in a way that feels heavy and intrusive. By avoiding the attempt to make these synthetic assets mimic organic fluid motion, the film ensures that the EVAs remain terrifying, architectural anomalies. They function as kinetic obstacles, their physical presence dictated by the physics of destruction rather than the physics of biology. The film's quiet effects, the set extensions of the ruined NERV headquarters and the infinite, white void landscapes of instrumentality, are masterclasses in atmospheric isolation. Through clever, layered compositing, these spaces are stripped of traditional perspective, creating a claustrophobic architecture that traps characters in their own thoughts. The background art shifts from detailed, decaying industrial brutalism to featureless, blinding horizons, using scale to highlight the insignificance of the human ego. This shifting environment serves as a visual metaphor for the dissolution of the self. As the characters lose their barriers, the environment loses its complexity, collapsing into the singular, absolute white of the primordial ocean. The aesthetic of the End of Evangelion is defined by a refusal to prioritize traditional visual expensiveness in favor of emotional clarity. The film leans into its jagged edges, high-contrast shadows, and, at times, purposely flat compositing, using these technical choices to articulate the breakdown of identity. The moments where the animation becomes experimental, incorporating sketches, line tests, and raw production artifacts, serve to expose the bones of the craft. This decision centers the viewer's attention on the labor and the vulnerability inherent in the creative process itself. It demands that the audience participate in the construction of the film's reality, acknowledging that the world they are watching is a manufactured, fragile construct. Ultimately, the technical craft serves as a conduit for the film's central thesis, the horror of human connection. The seamlessness of the world is sacrificed so that the internal fractures of the characters can remain visible. By fluctuating between different visual mediums and manipulating the rules of physics and perspective, the End of Evangelion transforms the screen into a mirror of human suffering and eventual transformation. The technical audacity of the production ensures that the final, devastating imagery, the desolate, abandoned shore, feels not just like an ending to a narrative, but as the inevitable, objective resolution of a long, arduous process of deconstruction. Audio, rhythm, and sensory manipulation. The End of Evangelion functions as a masterclass in sensory destabilization, where the craft of sound and rhythm serves as the primary mechanism for pulling the audience into Shinji Ikari's fracturing psyche. The film abandons traditional narrative flow in favor of an erratic, pulse-driven structure that forces the viewer to experience the collapse of reality as a visceral, auditory event. By manipulating the boundaries between diegetic sound, non-diegetic score, and profound silence, the film transforms the act of watching into an immersive psychological interrogation. The sonic environment of the film is aggressively overwhelming, defined by a layering of industrial dissonance and mechanical shrieks that mirror the encroaching apocalypse. During the assault on NERV, the sound mix prioritizes the harsh, discordant grinding of metal and the frantic, rhythmic pulses of warning sirens, trapping the viewer in a claustrophobic cage of technological failure. This soundscape refuses to offer a release, effectively placing the audience within the same suffocating, high-pressure state as the pilot. The score frequently bleeds into the sound effects, the wailing of the EVA units and the discordant orchestral swells of Shiro Sagisu's soundtrack become indistinguishable from the screams of the characters, erasing the line between external horror and internal trauma. When the boundaries of the self begin to dissolve, the sound design follows suit, replacing clarity with a thick, syrupy wash of ambient noise that renders the world increasingly abstract. Rhythm and editing operate in tandem to dismantle the viewer's sense of temporal stability. During sequences of heightened psychological distress, most notably the instrumentality sequence, the pacing accelerates into a frantic montage of rapid-fire imagery and jarring sound transitions. The film employs cut speeds that mimic the erratic, stuttering heartbeat of a person in the midst of a panic attack. By cutting away from horrific spectacle to quiet, static shots of everyday mundane objects or flashes of abstract color, the film forces the viewer to confront the fragility of the protagonist's worldview. This rhythmic instability ensures that the audience cannot anchor themselves in any singular tone or perspective, mirroring Shinji's own inability to reconcile his identity with the monumental shift occurring in his environment. Audio perspective plays a critical role in highlighting the isolation of the individual within a sea of collective consciousness. During scenes of interior monologue, the film frequently mutes the chaotic environmental noise, creating a vacuum that isolates the characters in a sterile, intimate space. This technique highlights the disparity between the world as a physical, noisy reality and the world as an internal, fractured mental construct. When the film cuts to silence, it acts as a weaponized void, stripping away the comfort of dialogue and music to force a confrontation with the absolute absence of meaning. The transition into the film's final moments, marked by the sudden reduction of the overwhelming orchestral score into a singular, haunting visual and auditory stillness, demonstrates a total commitment to the existential weight of the narrative. The technical execution of sound and pace serves as the ultimate proof of the film's philosophical intent. It treats the sensory experience as a direct extension of the character's cognitive state. The shift from the loud, grinding machinery of war to the unnerving, sterile silence of the post-human landscape is not merely an artistic choice, it is a profound declaration that the human experience is inherently tied to the perception of stimuli. By forcing the audience to endure the same rhythmic and auditory volatility as the protagonist, the End of Evangelion transforms technical craftsmanship into a mirror of the self. The sensory manipulation ensures that the breakdown of the world is felt as a physical, inescapable sensation, proving that the destruction of boundaries is as much an acoustic and rhythmic failure as it is a metaphysical one. The craft serves the philosophy, turning the final, silent confrontation into an intimate, crushing reality that lingers long after the image cuts to black. Synthesis of craft. The End of Evangelion functions as a visceral collapse of the barrier between the internal psychological state of its protagonist and the external reality of its world, achieving this synthesis through a radical subversion of traditional animation techniques. The film's technical execution relies on the aggressive collision of medium-specific textures, where the polished, cel-shaded precision of the series is intentionally dismantled in favor of mixed-media disruption. By inserting live-action photography, sketches, and avant-garde rotoscoping into the climax, the film shatters the illusion of a self-contained narrative world. This shift in medium acts as an ontological rupture, forcing the audience to acknowledge that the characters are not merely entities within a plot, but manifestations of real-world human trauma trapped within the synthetic prison of a screen. The cinematography reinforces this alienation through a sophisticated use of spatial geometry. In the scenes preceding the third impact, the framing frequently employs wide-angle lenses to distort the proportions of the NERV headquarters, rendering the facility as a claustrophobic, labyrinthine tomb rather than a base of operations. Conversely, when the narrative descends into the internal headspace of Shinji Ikari, the film switches to extreme close-ups and shallow depth of field, visually compressing the environment to highlight the character's inability to reconcile his existence with the outside world. This visual constriction mirrors the collapse of the individual ego, as the camera rejects wide, objective master shots in favor of a subjective, frantic perspective that maps directly onto the character's deteriorating mental state. Lighting serves as the primary instrument for psychological mapping. The film utilizes a harsh, high-contrast chiaroscuro that goes beyond mere dramatic flair. It functions as a visual representation of the Jungian shadow. During the most agonizing moments of the film, characters are frequently shrouded in deep, oppressive blacks that bleed into their silhouettes, physically manifesting the repressed desires, guilt, and self-loathing that they cannot articulate through dialogue. The light does not reveal the world, it slices through the characters, exposing their internal contradictions and leaving them perpetually exposed to their own darkest impulses. This high-contrast aesthetic creates an atmosphere of terminal isolation where no character can find a safe or neutral space to exist, as the environment itself seems to actively hunt for the flaws in their psyches. The film's integration of mixed media, specifically the usage of raw sketches and unsettling, grainy live-action sequences, serves as a technical metaphor for the breakdown of the narrative's reliability. By stripping away the gloss of the animation process, the film forces the viewer to confront the medium as an imperfect, human-made construct. This choice is deeply purposeful, as it strips away the artifice of traditional storytelling to expose the raw, unfiltered anxiety of the director's creative process. The edit becomes erratic and arrhythmic during these sequences, mimicking the fractured nature of panic or a nervous breakdown. This technical instability ensures that the audience cannot passively consume the spectacle. They are forced into an uncomfortable proximity with the images, mirroring the vulnerability of the characters who are currently having their boundaries of selfhood dissolved. Ultimately, the most technically demanding shots in the film, such as the surreal, sprawling composition of the mass-produced Evas rising into the sky or the sprawling, oceanic sea of LCL, are also its most philosophically profound. These sequences utilize a complex layering of hand-drawn animation, digital compositing, and unsettling environmental lighting to create a sense of scale that renders the individual human element entirely insignificant. The craft is designed to overwhelm the senses, mirroring the way in which the vast, inevitable machinery of the third impact renders human agency moot. The technical achievement of these shots lies in their ability to make the apocalyptic and the microscopic coexist in the same frame, proving that the scale of the tragedy is inseparable from the intimate, singular suffering of the characters. Every choice in the lens, the light, and the medium serves to articulate the final argument that reality is not an objective structure, but a fragile, subjective hallucination maintained only by the boundaries we draw between ourselves and the world. Part 6. Synthesis and Legacy. Synthesis and Legacy. The End of Evangelion functions as a finality that necessitates a return to the initial state of the psyche, completing a recursive loop that defines the existence of Shinji Ikari. The film begins with the promise of destruction and ends with the quiet, devastating restoration of the individual ego. This transition mirrors the opening of the series, where Shinji arrives in Tokyo 3 expecting a purpose only to find a battlefield. By the conclusion, the global catastrophe of the third impact has been reduced to a singular, intimate interaction between two wounded individuals on a barren beach. The cycle of trauma remains intact, but the subject's relationship to that cycle has shifted from passive acceptance of external directives to an active, albeit painful, acceptance of the self. As a cultural mirror, the film reflects the profound anxieties of late 90s Japanese society, where the collapse of economic stability and the rise of technological isolationism collided with the remnants of traditional social structures. The film serves as a manifestation of the lost decade, where the dream of a frictionless, futuristic society crumbled, revealing the fragile, organic chaos beneath the steel and neon of Tokyo 3. It captures the specific terror of a generation forced to confront a world where grand narratives, whether scientific, religious, or corporate, no longer provide a coherent explanation for human suffering. The film introduces an innovation in the medium through its aggressive integration of mixed media, utilizing live-action footage, charcoal drawings, and traditional cell animation to collapse the boundary between the viewer and the viewed. This technical disruption forces an epistemic fracture. When the screen flashes with images of the audience and the interior of actual cinemas, the barrier between the narrative and the reality of the spectator dissolves. This stylistic choice asserts that the internal struggle of the protagonist is not a contained event but a universal psychological condition that permeates the very space where the film is consumed. The unresolved conflict, the precise nature of the interaction between Shinji and Asuka at the film's climax, remains its most potent feature. By choosing to end on a moment of profound ambiguity and physical violence, the film rejects the comfort of a clean resolution. This gap provides the space for the audience to project their own unresolved traumas onto the characters. The final, chilling line, "How disgusting," serves as a testament to the fact that human connection is inherently messy and painful, and that the return to individual consciousness is a burden as much as it is a liberation. The visual legacy of the film persists in its refusal to adhere to the traditional cinematic language of heroism. Instead, it utilizes scale to emphasize the insignificance of the individual against the system, while simultaneously using extreme close-ups to claustrophobically trap the viewer inside the protagonist's neurosis. The final image of the film, a red, post-apocalyptic landscape under a scarred sky, is the ultimate metaphor for this realization: the world is broken, the systems have failed, and the only remaining task is to continue existing within the wreckage. The film demands that the viewer stop searching for an external savior or a structural solution and instead embrace the terrifying agency of the individual. It suggests that while the struggle to remain separate from others leads to inevitable hurt, the act of choosing that existence remains the only meaningful rebellion against a void of forced, universal unity. The finality offered here is not a promise of peace, but an endorsement of the individual's right to define their own meaning, even in the ruins of a reality that has long since ceased to be coherent.